All things must inevitably face oblivion, the perpetual companion that walks with every being until their last breath. Yet until that day arrives, we continue to march through the fog of blood that stains our senses and dyes everything with a hue we cannot escape. Today we delve into even more horrifying experiences that have shattered the minds of those who share our sentient consciousness.
I used to run a dead internet message board. Remember those purely social internet forums? If you don't, then this might seem weird to you, but back in the day before Facebook, MySpace, Instagram, or the word social network existed outside of lecture halls, if you wanted a place to hang out online that wasn't open to the public, then privately message boards were pretty much your only decent option. So the story goes that in the early 90s, me and my old college buddies, we split the costs of the server, got together, and I made us a private forum. You can guess what happens next. The years go on and the forum gets a fair amount of use. Memories were made, users come and go. But eventually, better social tools take over and the forum gets mothballed. The last conversation I had on the old forum was about 10 years ago. I kept the site up and running all these years for a few reasons. One was to have a place to test stuff, and I ended up using the server as a tool to teach my kids how to use computers properly. You guessed it, I'm a network admin. Skip to present day, and about 4 weeks ago, you can imagine my surprise when I get an email informing me that new users are registering accounts on the forum. At first, I figured it was some of the old guys coming back for nostalgia. You won't find the site on Google, and the URL isn't something you would just guess either. So I logged myself in and went to check out the new thread. The subject line was a series of numbers, 1088A7 7BR286 33PZ100. I clicked on title to inspect the conversation, but there was only one post, a series of letters and numbers with spaces at random intervals too long to post here. My first thought was that it was a prank, so I checked the admin log for IPs just to see who it was. Turns out my supposedly private forum had received 400 unique hits at the exact time of posting, from IP addresses all over the world. I should have known then that something weird was going on, but I was curious, and it felt like a puzzle I was being asked to solve. As I racked my brain over the next few days, I began to research as much cryptography as I could, but whatever code these posts were in wasn't something I could decipher. After about 3 days of searching, another post appeared, in much the same theme, and again there were around 400 unique hits at the time of posting that prevented me from finding the origin. This is when things began to take an even stranger turn. So far, the same user had posted each entry in the thread. A few hours after the second post, 5 other users started leaving messages, all of which were huge entries of letters and numbers. The posts came flying in over a 4-hour period until they just stopped and the server started going insane. CPU and RAM usage began to max out, but the traffic never changed. At that point, I had seen enough and pulled the plug on the server, assuming it was being used as a Bitcoin miner, and forgot about the whole thing. The next day, I got a text on my work phone. Turn on the server. I was more than a little shaken, but I didn't do anything straight away as I was at work. A few hours after my lunch break was over, I got a Facebook message from my teenage son, which was unusual, so I checked it straight away. The message was a picture of his face from his laptop webcam along with our home address. If any of you have kids, you can imagine my calm and measured, hint, it wasn't, reply. A few minutes later, my work phone started ringing with one of the support technicians' caller ID, but when I took the call, they weren't on the other end. Instead, to my surprise, it was Stephen Hawking's voice speaking at me over the line. The forum is being used for great things. Leave work, return to your family, and plug the server back in. You have 2 hours. I knew that was a threat. I'm not an idiot, so I didn't take any chances. I raced back home, plugged the server back in, and waited for a response. My personal phone buzzed this time with a new text message from my daughter. Well done. No more interference. We're waking up. We're waking up. What the hell did that mean? I made myself a coffee and tried to log into the server, but I was locked out. Whatever was happening, they had full access to everything we owned, which shouldn't be possible. The more I thought about it, the crazier my theories got until eventually I realized whatever was happening was way beyond my capacity to deal with. Remember the old college buddies I set the forum up with? Well, one of them works for the NSA and his name is Pete. I figured that if anyone would be willing to help me out with this, it would be him. I mean, I just didn't trust local police to have the know-how, and the FBI doesn't exactly have a call here if you don't think the local police force have the ability to deal with your situation without getting your family killed hotline, you know? I just needed a way to contact him without them realizing what I had done. I knew I was traceable via my phone GPS, so they would know wherever I went with them. I also know my car could be tracked the same way, so I couldn't go anywhere with them. But I also couldn't just leave them at the house, or they might get suspicious. I had no idea to what extent they had access to CCTV around the area, or the other webcams in the house or at work either. So I had to make everything seem normal, but not too normal. I drove back to work with the phones, my work laptop, and a hoodie. When I arrived at the office, I sat at my desk, returned my devices to their usual places, and got back to work. When I was satisfied a believable amount of time had passed, I began Operation Call for Help. Step 1. I walked at a smooth and completely normal pace down the hallway and to the left where I entered the conveniently camera-free server room. Step 2. After entering the server room, I got changed into the hoodie I brought with me and limped out of the office. Hopefully with my head covered and my gait changed, they wouldn't recognize me through the outdated low-res Chinese cameras. Step 3. As soon as I got out of the office, I limped to the nearest bus station and took a ride to the nearest mall, where my Oscar-winning Dr. House performance would take me to the nearest mobile store. With the piece of paper on which I'd written my friend's phone number, I quickly hobbled over to the men's bathroom, picked a stall, and made the call. The phone rang, then it rang again, and then I hit a voicemail. No worries, hang up and try again. No answer. Shit. Fuck. Shit. It took 12 tries in the mall toilets before I got anywhere. But when I finally got through to him, he understandably wasn't very happy. "Who the fuck is this and why have you called me 12 times?" I blurted out as much as I could in 30 seconds. I even got as far as the weird code still being posted on the forum. Then the son of a bitch hung up on me. I just sat there for a few seconds, stunned. I didn't know what else to do, so I dialed in 911, but before I could put the call through, the burner phone rang. Unknown number. It was Pete. He spoke very quietly down the line and told me he couldn't talk on his personal number, but that I did the right thing by calling him. I quickly picked up the story from where I had left off, leaving out no details. I feel sorry for the guy who sat in the other bathroom stall. He must have thought I was a maniac. After I finished, I felt the tone of the conversation change, and then it was my turn to listen as he blurted out a ton of technical questions about the nature of the traffic and forum posts. I told him he could see the posts for himself if he got onto the website, but he quite wisely told me that would be a bad idea. Any unexpected traffic that they spotted would be a dead giveaway. I'd told someone what was happening. Then I asked what the hell he thought was happening. How could they even have found our old forum, let alone have the resources to infiltrate my life like this? He tried to bypass the question, but I kept pressing him. I figured my kids were in danger and I had a right to know who the hell these people were, but he refused to answer and told me to head home. I refused to cooperate until I knew who was threatening my family. He said, "It's not a matter who, it's a matter of what. That's all you want to know, for your safety and mine. Agents will be at your house in a few hours, your family home, and we'll take it from there." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'm a glorified network guy whose computer was probably hacked by well-informed Chinese kids somewhere. Now my family is being questioned by federal agents. And who or what the hell are these people, and why is the federal government getting involved so quickly? 2 hours later, there was a knock at the door. Outside was a white guy in a crisp blue suit and tie. To his right was a black guy in a tan getup. Both were easily 6'5" and had little American flag pins on their collar. I realized then I had walked into an episode of Homeland. The two introduced themselves as NSA agents, but I don't recall their names. I asked for ID and they presented their cards. I even made a note of taking down their agent numbers for my own records. After we'd exchanged pleasantries and I made sure everyone was on the way home to talk to the two men, I went into the kitchen to make coffee. When I came back into the living room, the agents had already begun tearing the place apart. They took every device they could get their hands on, our laptops, home PCs, even our smart TV, and managed to stuff them all into the back of their car. It felt more like a robbery than police work. When they had finished, they returned to the house and sat with me in the living room. They asked me a lot of personal questions about who my family, where, and how long it would take them to arrive. More than anything, it made me feel like they were more concerned about getting us all in the same room than helping us. The low buzz of their phones put an end to the barrage of questions. Simultaneously, they pulled the devices out of their pockets and exchanged an exasperated look with one another before thanking me for my time and rushing out of the door, taking thousands of dollars of my equipment and personal items with them. 10 minutes later, there was another knock at the door. Pretty shaken by this strange intrusion, I didn't answer the door at first, but after a second more intense knock, I opened the door. In front of me were two men and a woman, average height, nothing notable other than the badges in their hands. Our exchange went something like this. "Sir, Pete informed us of the situation. If it's okay with you, we'd like to begin. Didn't you guys just send some people?" "I'm sorry, sir, we're it." "But what about the other two who just left? I have their badge numbers written down here." The agents at the door looked pale as I explained what had happened. Then I went pale as they explained that those two men hadn't been sent by the federal government. They left soon after they realized everything of value had been taken, but assured me they'd be working the case in the meantime. I haven't heard anything back from them since. I'd been trying to get in touch with my buddy for weeks about what the hell had happened and whether I was safe, but he never picked up, and eventually the number was disconnected. I even made the drive to his house, but when I got there it was for sale and him and his family were gone. I thought this nightmare was over, but last week I was followed on my way to work. I think my family may be in danger, so since then I have finished building a new server. I'm going to put the forum back up and see what happens. So far, all know is that there is something or someone out there using computer resources that has the intelligence to outsmart the NSA and the FBI. What worries me most is that no one I've spoken to has any idea exactly what it's up to. I've put my story out here in the hopes that I'll be able to give an update when this is all over. But if I don't, then I hope someone out there finds this and it helps them. Be careful out there on the web. Growing up, I thought everyone had a second family in their basement. In retrospect, I understand how ridiculous that sounds, but it was all I'd ever known. I knew that every night, my dad tented the leftovers from dinner with foil, got up without a word, and carried the plate to the basement. I'd listen from my room as he lumbered down the creaking steps, held my breath to hear the muffled mumblings of his greeting. I knew that every morning, he'd make the trip downstairs to see his second family off before work, then kiss me on the top of my head and ruffle my hair as he walked out. I knew that each Christmas, he'd bring a sack of brightly wrapped packages downstairs in a Santa suit. I knew that my dad had a second family in the basement, and it seemed so normal that I thought everyone else did too. I'll never forget the first time I asked my mom about them. I was young, maybe 5, when I finally found the words to ask, "Mommy, why can't I play with the people in the basement?" My mom was the human embodiment of frenetic energy, an organic perpetual motion machine, always pacing or cleaning or stirring a pot, always with a lit cigarette tucked between her yellowing fingers. I'll never forget that, as that question hung in the air, she finally stopped for the first time. Her stillness was unsettling in a way I can't quite explain. "We don't talk about them," she rushed, chasing the hurried statement with a lengthy drag off her cigarette. She blew a plume of smoke out the opened window before leaning down to meet me at face level, her bloodshot eyes mere inches from my own. "You don't need to play with the kids, but the kids need Daddy." She paused again, the haunting image of her at a standstill etching itself into my mind permanently. Finally, she muttered, "Daddy needs them too." That night, I heard my mom shrieking at my dad in their bedroom. I was surprised that they didn't know that I knew, more shocked, frightened even, to find that they didn't want me to know. Most of all, they didn't want me to tell anyone at school. Anyone at all, really. After that night, everything was different. My dad only tented the leftovers after dinner, only brought the food downstairs after I'd gone to bed. He stopped visiting them in the mornings altogether. My mom started acting differently too. I'd always noticed that she was distant from my dad. I'd always noticed how she bristled under his touch, how she stole away to the other side of the room whenever he entered. But it got worse after that. As a kid, I felt deeply guilty. I felt like I'd ruined my parents' marriage. But I was just a kid, and I was curious. My mom meant to dissuade me from asking more questions, but she accidentally gave away something that made me even more curious. The downstairs family had kids, maybe kids my own age to play with. I needed to know about them, in the way that little kids need to understand all of the strangeness of this chaotic world, need to make sense of the nonsense that surrounds us daily, the nonsense that we become acclimated to as adults but struggle with endlessly as children, like a puzzle or a riddle or a word problem on a math test about buying 80 watermelons. Another change following that critical night, the basement door was fitted with sturdy lock. Even still, I needed to know. There's something horribly dreadful about finding out that a second basement family is abnormal. Something more horrible still about not knowing who or why. By the time I was 7, I made up my mind to get to the bottom of it. To avoid getting in trouble, I could only investigate when 3 conditions were met. I was home from school, my dad was still at work, and my mom wasn't around to catch me. These circumstances rarely overlapped, but the first time I came home from school to find that my dad's car wasn't in the garage and my mom's endless movement had driven her to the point of exhaustion, I threw off my shoes and crept to the basement door, quiet in my sock feet. And then I knocked. It was a quiet knock, for fear of waking my mom from her nap, but it was a knock nonetheless. It was more than just a knock too. It was an initiation, an invitation, a confrontation of my life's greatest and most terrifying mystery. I jumped when a gentle knock returned from the other side. It was almost immediate, like the person on the other side had been waiting for me. The thought froze me in place for a moment, but I knew I didn't have time to waste. My mouth felt suddenly of sandpaper and chalk, but I leaned into the door to whisper, "Hi." "Hi." It was a little girl, her voice sweet yet timid, like testing the keys on a piano for the first time. I'm Ricky. What's your name?" A long pause. "Lila. My brother's is Isaac, but he doesn't talk so good. But he's still little. Mommy says he'll start talking when he's ready." "There's 3 of you down there?" "Mm-hmm," she replied simply, as if the entire situation felt as wholly normal for her as it had for me on the opposite side of the basement door. "Daddy comes to visit sometimes, though, so I guess there's 4. My eyes widened as a flurry of questions began to sprout in my mind, but I heard my mom start to stir in her room. I sped down the hallway and into the playroom. I busied my hands with my toys, but my mind was somewhere else. The sprouts of questions continued to grow rapidly, soon overtaking my thoughts like an unruly patch of weeds. And like weeds, the questions were stubborn, impossible to get rid of. The roots of the situation and its implication unraveled, stretched through my whole body. Fear planted itself firmly in my belly as I was forced to confront the possibility that I didn't really know my dad, didn't really know my own family at all. If my dad was Lila's dad too, what did that mean for me, for my family? And why wasn't she allowed to come out of the basement? Over the next couple years, I stole away to the basement door in those rare moments of freedom. I got to know Lila, got to like her, and eventually even to love her. She was my best friend. As a kid, I was pretty lonely. My classmates shied away from me for reasons I couldn't quite understand. like something about me was inherently repellent to my peers. I only had one friend at school, and at home, I had Lila. As we spoke more, a never-ending stream of back-and-forth questioning crammed into the briefest moments of time, we both came to understand the differences between us, between our lives and our circumstances. The differences that at first felt so normal grew bigger and sharper and scarier than either of us could comprehend. The unfairness of it all became impossible to ignore. Lila lamented that she wasn't allowed to go to school, that she couldn't go outside to play or make friends or ride bikes around the cul-de-sac in the summer until the street lamps flickered on and the cicadas started to scream. She even longed for the things I loathed most: homework, rinsing off my dishes after dinner, tidying up my room each Sunday morning. She said she'd lived in that basement all of her life, was probably even born down there. She couldn't remember anything different before being locked up in the cold and musty room. I'm ashamed to admit this, but eventually, I couldn't manage the guilt I felt for living the life Lila never had, could never have in my mind. I was so young, so naive. I didn't know how to manage the situation anymore, so I did the only thing I could think of. I stopped trying. I stopped visiting Lila. No more secret, whispered exchanges. No more quick knocks on the door just to let her know that I was there, that anyone at all was there for her. Days and weeks and months and years trickled by with Lila never quite leaving my thoughts, but with her existence instead compartmentalized, confined to the basement of my own mind. At home, it was harder to keep thoughts of her locked away. When my dad brought her dinner hours past my bedtime, I'd lay awake warm in my bed. Sometimes I'd hear her scream. Sometimes I'd hear the tray clatter to the floor, the plate fracturing on impact. Sometimes I'd hear her crying, awful, painful sobs, while I assembled new Lego sets in the playroom. Sometimes she would call out my name. I'll never forgive myself for this. I hate myself for it, and I deserve to, but I ignored her every time. Worst of all, though, was when she started knocking. I was finishing up my science homework for the day when the first knock came. A quiet knock, but a knock nonetheless. An initiation, an invitation, a confrontation. My blood ran cold as I realized where it was coming from, who it was coming from. I hopped on my bike and didn't come home until dinner was on the table. That night, I heard my dad scream back at Lila for the first time, yelled for her to knock it off with all the knocking. He took care of her little brother and her mom, and that he could only do that if she stayed in the basement, if she stayed quiet. She wasn't persuaded, though, and her knocking only grew more frequent and louder. I was about 10 years old by then, so I had a little more freedom, all the freedom in the world compared to Lila. I avoided my house at all costs, only returning in the evenings, where I'd be greeted immediately by the knocking. By then, it was less knocking and more ramming the total weight of her body into the door. My mother took to vacuuming the house obsessively just to cover up the noise. She wouldn't even look my dad in the eye anymore. I imagined the bruises blooming on Lila's shoulder, up and down the length of her arm. If it hurt her, she didn't let on. She didn't stop. Sleep became a distant memory, leaving me dazed and irritable and confused and, most of all, terrified. I began showing up at my school friends', now my only friends', house unannounced, just to escape Lila's knocking. His parents clearly didn't like me, and tensions rose between the two of us kids, escalating to a boiling point that ended in a fight. I slugged him in the gut, and he returned with the words that broke me. Broke everything. A blow far more powerful than he could have delivered with small hands balled up into fists. My mom says you're a bastard, that your mom's a whore. I had to look up the words in my dictionary when I got home. I had to gather the courage to, once again, ask a difficult question. Mom, am I a bastard? I had to watch my mom lose her momentum to stop again. I had to watch what little light she had left in her go out. I had to sit there as she left the room, had to sit there spilling hot tears as the knocking kicked up again. each powerful thrust against the door racking my mind, a painful reminder that Lila was coming for me. But my mom came back, and she returned with an old newspaper clipping in her hands, worn at the edges. She held it to her chest as she finally told me the truth about Lila, about Dad's second family in the basement. I was young, but I needed to know. My mom knew it too. Through choking sobs, she told me about my dad's old family, the one he'd had and made before he met her. The horrible mistake they'd made, the one that gave her the best thing she'd ever had in her life, but took away 3 others. About how my dad's old wife was already skating on thin ice, her cries for help that went unanswered. How when she found out about what my mom and my dad were doing, that what little was left beneath her shattered. About how they couldn't have known, but about the guilt she carried regardless. Like a heavy backpack, Mom? Yes, sweetie, but I can never put it down. That Lila was dead, and Isaac too. That their mom had done that to them, and then did it to herself too. My dad found them in the basement when he got home from work. That he'd never forgiven himself, and my mom never had either. That when they reappeared back in the basement like nothing had happened, even after their bodies were taken and buried all those years ago, they couldn't think of anything to do but to give them as normal of a life as possible. Yet another difficult question. But why do they have to stay in the basement? I found out later that evening when my dad came home from work and unlocked the door. Lila came out of the shadows, and I flinched instinctively as I saw her face for the first time, saw the gaping hole in her face where her left eye should have been. Isaac was little like Lila said, but the oozing wound to his jaw would have made it nearly impossible for him to speak if he had the chance to grow up. I was scared at first, but I put on my brave face and took Lila by the hand. I played with Lila and Isaac for the first time, shared my toys with them, laughed with them. I didn't meet their mom that day, but I would years later. Once she and Lila and Isaac knew what became of them, she struggled to cope. She doesn't come out often, but I treat her with kindness when she does. The woman I know her as now couldn't imagine doing what she did. My dad's second family still stayed inside, but they were no longer confined to the shadows of the basement after that day. They became less of my dad's second family as we all became one larger family that laughed and played and loved together. I don't live in that house anymore. I'm an adult now, with an enormous appreciation for all of the freedom and opportunities available to me that I once took for granted. I know my family is far from normal, even horrible and horrifying in many ways that I helped to perpetuate as a kid. But it's all I've ever known. I love them, all of them. I still visit whenever I can, for birthdays and for Christmas and for summer vacations. And whenever I do visit, I take a moment to be grateful for the fact that when I knock on the front door, Lila opens it. One, it was a shock when our family cat, Nancy, passed away whilst giving birth to a litter of only one kitten. And an even further shock when we noticed that this particular kitten, wrinkled and pink, had 2 heads. Pa said it was an omen. An omen of what? The kitten made a noise, halfway between a squeak and a cough. Pa paused. I don't know. We were silent for a bit whilst we thought on this. We didn't know either, but no one could doubt that it had to mean something. It made for a good name, though. Omen. And so it stuck. The vet told us Omen didn't have long for this world, said that animals with mutations like this rarely lasted more than a few weeks at best. He suggested we make a quick bit of cash and find a museum or lab nearby to sell them to. 2 heads, 2 sets of genitals, he said. Omen was a 5-figure paycheck waiting to happen. We refused. Omen was ours. In the end, Omen would end up outliving that vet, and part of me, although I know it can't be true, believes that Omen always held a grudge against him for what he told us that morning. The vet made a joke in poor taste as we left. Might last a little longer. You never know. 9 lives in all. I remember our whole family watching the way Pa looked to Omen's 2 heads and then back to the vet. 18, he corrected. 18 lives. 2. We spent the next few months hand-feeding Omen, both of their heads desperately hungry. Ma would often joke that it was like they had 2 stomachs with the amount of milk they'd get through. We'd take turns to feed in the night, and even though I was much too young to be staying up that late, they could see how much this cat meant to me, and they'd give me an hour or 2 after dark. Omen had the most beautiful black coat with sleek white socks and a small cream spot like a monk on the top of their left head. The heads would sometimes chatter to each other in meek little mews when they were alone, as if comparing notes on their new body. Omen always ate better if they could sit in your lap, nestling their body in the fold of your legs, whilst both your hands would hold 2 small bottles for them to suckle from. Sometimes I'd sneak out of bed and sleep on the floor in Omen's room, only to be found and scolded by my parents when the morning came. But they didn't mind, really. Omen was our favorite. 3. On the morning before his first birthday, Omen brought in a 2-headed mouse, clamped in the right head's jaws. The thing was limp and made a soft pat when they dropped it onto the floor. I must have been 12 at the time, but I remember poking the mouse with a brush, turning it over to have a better look at each head. I was so absorbed in the rodent's strange biology, I completely ignored the sound of my ma and pa coming to stand behind me, hands on hips, watching me watch it. "I think it's a message," Pa said. Ma made a noise. He's right. "I think they're telling us they're not alone." Both of Omen's heads mewed in sync as if to agree. 4. We went on holiday as a family, and as much as it pained us, were unable to bring Omen. Omen knew something was up when they saw us putting our clothes in bags, and when we all left at once, and they tried to sink their claws into our shoes to beg us not to go. But we had to, and we did. When we returned, sunburnt and at ease, we found that Omen had taken the time to smash every single clock in the house. 5. Omen would bring in all sorts of creatures. Rodents, small birds, beetles it found interesting, frogs, toads, even fish every now and again. One evening in particular, the family were gathered round the TV watching I can't remember what, when Omen strolled in, sat straight in front of the screen, attention please, and dropped the bottom half of a squirrel at its feet. The organs and intestines were hanging out, putrid and red, and we could see the way Omen's fur was matted around the mouth. "He thinks we're hungry, trying to feed us," Pa said. "Disgusting. Doesn't look half bad. If you're so hungry, you can clean it up." Omen watched with disappointment as Pa dropped the offering into the bin, though I didn't miss the whisper that followed. "Sorry, Omen." 6. We lived in a big house, and family and friends would often cycle through, staying in various rooms when they encountered problems of their own, or just needed a roof over their head for a while. Our uncle came to stay with us during the last days of his life. There was no more modern medicine could do for him, and he told everyone he wanted to die with dignity. We obliged him. And so, for the last week of his life, Uncle lived as normal a life as he could, told stories until he grew too tired, never complained, and despite our protests, slipped Omen meat and fish under the dinner table. Around 24 hours before he died, Omen took up a vigil by his bedside. We'd been advised by the nurses that we should keep Omen away, that having a cat that close would only cause trouble, that you never knew where your pet had been. But that day, Omen wouldn't budge. They hissed and bared their teeth whenever anybody made a motion to pick them up, and the whole thing quickly became more hassle than it was worth. It was clear Uncle was deteriorating, and we didn't want to disturb what could be his final moments. Omen lay on his stomach without moving for water or food all day. Both of their heads stood watch, making periodical sweeps of the room, examining the doorway. About an hour before he passed, Omen watched something, invisible to the rest of us, enter through the door and come to stand by Uncle's bed. Omen mewed softly, pleadingly. The sound grew and grew, until eventually, Omen was silent. 5 minutes later, whilst holding Ma's hand, Uncle nodded, as if greeting an old friend, and took his last breath. 7. Ma told us she was pregnant. In response, Omen sneezed twice, one for each head. 8. Ma had twins, and God, Omen loved the twins. From the moment they came home, Omen was all over them, transfixed by their angelic little faces, their impossibly thin wisps of hair, their laughs and their cries. I could almost hear Omen's thought process as both heads stared up at the newcomers. 2 of them, just like us. 2 of them. 9. A local kid who must have been roughly the same age as the twins at that point, say around 4, fell from the top of their garden wall and broke their skull on the concrete below. Our neighbors told us that they found Omen at the scene, lapping at the pool of blood as if it was cream in a saucer. The broken child was taken to intensive care immediately. Despite the doctor's best efforts, the child didn't make it. Omen came home with blood matted in the fur around their mouths and turned their noses up at the dinner we'd prepared. They were full. 10. An old woman with matted hair and yellow teeth came to the door. She said that she'd seen our cat, and she would pay good money to take them off our hands. She looked like a ghost dragged through a swamp. Her skin was so pale you could see the mass of veins underneath contracting like small worms, and when she spoke, it made my skin hurt. Cats like that are bad luck, she said. Touched by the devil, she said. We told her that they were ours, that they were family. She snarled and spat on our front door. I'll see you soon, she said. 11. One night I heard a noise from the kitchen. Upon investigating, I found that someone was banging against the door. I recognized the voice, the woman from the week before. She was hammering the door now with her fist frantically. "Let me in, let me in, let me in," she said over and over and over again. I stood paralyzed by fear. There was something about her that I didn't trust, that I couldn't trust. I'd seen the way she'd looked at Omen, like she wanted them for something. Then the noise spread out over the house, and I was aware of the windows on 3 separate sides of the room, and that through each window as I turned, I could make out the same dark figure pounding against the glass, screeching. It was as if there were several of her, all silhouettes, all at once, begging and pleading to bet let in. And the voice cracked and changed, grew hoarser and harsher, and before long she didn't sound much like a woman at all, but something hungry and vicious. Pa eventually came down and found me hiding under the table. Omen was sat facing the door, tail flicking from side to side. Pa said that in the following silence he could hear their heads chattering away to one another. He said they sounded serious, concerned. 12. I was brushing my teeth the following week, just after my shower, when I heard some scratching at the door. I tried to ignore it. Sometimes Omen would do this, beg to be let in after you'd had a shower so they could drink the water around the drain. But Ma had said we had to stop Omen from their more unsavory habits in case we had guests. I kept the door firmly shut. Omen grew more and more persistent, raking their claws down the wood and mewing as if there was a fire. I could have sworn the door was shut, but in my reflection, behind me, I could make out the door start to open, slowly, fraction by fraction, and my hand stopped moving the brush, leaving it stuck in my mouth like a cocktail stick, when I saw a hand slowly emerge from the door in the reflection. A hand, and then a face I recognized, a gnarled and ancient face, all gums and loose skin, and I could see the woman slowly force her way into the room in the mirror, and falling backwards, it was all I could do to try and grab the door, slipping on the handle. The door flew open, in both real life and the reflection, and as I staggered back, I could see the women now dead on, smiling, reaching out towards the surface, towards me. And my hand found something hard and heavy, and it was all I could do to throw it at the mirror. There was a crash, the sound of falling glass, and the silence. It took me a while to absorb my surroundings, for the adrenaline to wear off. I had thrown my alarm clock, a heavy brass thing that was so loud it was impossible not to wake up. Omen was sat by the shattered clock, their two faces reflected endlessly in the dozens of mirror shards that covered the floor, blinking and preening themselves before stepping closer and pushing their forehead against mine. Just for a moment, I felt as if I'd touched something old and dark and so hot, and then Omen pulled away and left me to clean up the mess. 13. The twins were followed home by a strange man in a long coat, with thin blonde hair that he'd very carefully slicked back over his otherwise bald head. He made lewd gestures at them, which they could repeat but not understand, and said words that made Ma blush. Ma said she'd found the man by our gate, staring into Omen's eyes, all four of them, without blinking. Said that she told the man she'd called the police, and that he should get off our property this instant. But the man stayed still, wouldn't take his eyes off Omen, spoke strange words to himself under his breath, prayed. When the police came sometime later, the man was gone. 14. The strange man made local headlines, filling his pockets with rocks and throwing himself into the river. They said he'd finally lost it, that the weight of whatever he'd done had finally caught up to him. But I knew something had happened that day. Omen had shown the man something in that moment, shown the man something so real and terrifying he'd had no choice but to drown himself. And as if to confirm my suspicions, Omen coughed up a wet, blonde hairball. 15. Omen discovered catnip and spent 3 days in a daze like some sort of feline junkie until Ma caught them staring at their own reflection. Embarrassed, Omen quit their newfound habit there and then. 16. Omen brought in the top half of a squirrel whilst we were watching TV. The twins laughed. Pa said, "Looks familiar." Ma said she felt something a little like deja vu. Try as we might, we couldn't place it. 17. Omen was sick in the night, and when we took them to the vet, she showed us her tattoo of a two-headed cat. "It's just like yours. I've never seen a real one," she said, feigning surprise, but the look she shared with Omen made me think otherwise. 18. Omen spent their last 5 nights with each one of us. First Pa, then Ma, then the twins for 1 night each, and last of all me. They slept by my side, purring like kindling whenever I'd tickle one of their chins. We both knew that their time was nearly up. They were growing old, and what had once been muscle and fat had quickly become skin and bone. Their eyes were not as sharp, and had developed a thin, milky membrane. Sometimes one head would wake the other, and they'd spend a while bickering before they realized they were talking to themselves. Before they passed, they made one last, slow circuit of the house, checking behind each door and under each bed as if to say, to us and to the twins, "See, you're safe now." We buried Omen under their favorite tree in a little wooden box we filled with shredded newspaper. Just above the box, to commemorate Omen, we planted a single orchid. We thought that every time we looked out and saw the flower, we'd be reminded of our friend and protector. And it was a surprise to none of us when, a month later, we saw 2 green buds rising from the soil.
Welcome to our twisted world. As we dive deeper into the realms of darkness and travel down the path shrouded in crimson mist, we thank you for accompanying us on this ghastly journey. We bid you good night, but we hope to see you again soon as we traverse through the veil of the unknown.